mother-in-law gave her a used apron for Christmas. Everyone laughed, but the gift she gave back destroyed her. Sarah Collins stared at the pregnancy test in her small bathroom on Christmas morning, tears of joy streaming down her face. After 2 years of trying, she and James would finally have their baby. Her hand trembled as she wrapped the vintage silver brooch she'd sold her car to buy for her mother-in-law, Margaret Thompson. Maybe this would finally be the Christmas when Margaret would accept her. The Thompson mansion stood decorated like a scene from a holiday magazine, its pristine white exterior adorned with tasteful Christmas lights. Sarah's hands clutched the carefully wrapped gift as she and James walked up the marble steps. "She'll love it this year, honey. I just know it." James squeezed her hand, but Sarah saw the worry in his eyes. Inside, the grand dining room buzzed with conversation from Connecticut's elite. Margaret Thompson, at 65, commanded the room in her designer dress and perfectly coiffed silver hair. Her eyes narrowed as Sarah placed her homemade apple pie on the dessert table. "Oh dear," Margaret's voice carried across the room. "Sarah, darling, we usually serve French pastries from Philippe's. But how quaint of you to bring something homemade." The room fell silent as several guests poorly concealed their smirks. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she straightened her shoulders. "I used my grandmother's recipe, Mrs. Thompson. She taught me that food made with love tastes the best." "Love?" Margaret laughed coldly. "My dear, this is the Thompson family Christmas dinner, not some small-town potluck. But speaking of appropriate places," she gestured to her assistant, who brought forward a box wrapped in cheap paper. Sarah's stomach churned as she opened the gift, aware of all eyes on her. Inside lay a stained, clearly used apron, the kind served to kitchen staff. "I thought this would help you understand your place in this family better," Margaret announced, her voice dripping with disdain. "After all, a teacher's salary hardly qualifies you for much more than serving at these gatherings, does it?" The room erupted in nervous titters. Sarah's hands shook as she accidentally dropped the gift she'd brought for Margaret. The silver brooch tumbled out, one of its diamonds breaking loose on the marble floor. "Oh my," Margaret's eyebrows raised. "Trying to buy your way into our family with cheap jewelry? How embarrassing." "It's not cheap," a family friend spoke up, her voice thick with disapproval. "Everyone knows Sarah sold her car to buy that antique Thompson brooch. It's been in your family for generations before it was sold off during the Depression." The room fell silent again, but this time the tension was palpable. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat, the morning sickness choosing this exact moment to surge. She rushed from the room, barely making it to the bathroom before getting sick. James's voice boomed from the dining room. "How dare you, Mother? Sarah's pregnant, for God's sake. We came here to share our joy, and you treat her like dirt." Sarah could hear Margaret's dismissive response. "Pregnant? Well, let's hope the child inherits some Thompson class, though given its mother's breeding, I doubt it." Through her tears, Sarah heard chairs scraping and James's footsteps approaching. His face was red with fury as he helped her up. "We're leaving. I'm done with her cruelty." As they walked out, Sarah caught a glimpse of Margaret's face. For a split second, something like regret flickered in her eyes. But then it hardened into that familiar cold stare, the one that had made Sarah feel worthless for the past 3 years. In the car, Sarah clutched the stained apron. "I tried so hard, James. I really thought this Christmas would be different." James gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "It will be different, Sarah. Because we're done. No more holidays with her. No more trying to win her approval. Our baby deserves better than a grandmother who thinks money equals worth." What neither of them knew was that this Christmas would indeed be different, but in ways none of them could imagine. The stained apron would become more than just a symbol of Margaret's cruelty. It would become the key to unraveling 3 generations of secrets, lies, and a truth that would shake the Thompson empire to its very foundation. Sarah spent the week after Christmas caring for her grandmother, Rose Miller, in her modest apartment on the outskirts of town. The old woman's health had been declining, but her spirit remained strong. As Sarah prepared her grandmother's medications, she couldn't hold back her tears any longer. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Rose asked from her armchair, setting aside her knitting. "You've been quiet since Christmas." Sarah sat on the floor next to her grandmother, just like she used to as a child. I tried so hard to make Mrs. Thompson accept me, Grandma. I even sold my car to buy her a special gift. But she... Sarah's voice cracked as she described the Christmas dinner disaster. Rose's face darkened. The Thompsons, of course. She reached for Sarah's hand. There's something you need to know about that family, but first, tell me about the baby. When are you due? Sarah managed a smile. Early August. James is hoping for a girl. A great-grandchild. Rose's eyes sparkled. I need to stay strong to meet this little one. She tried to stand but stumbled slightly. Sarah rushed to steady her. Grandma, you need to rest, the doctor said. The doctor doesn't know what I know, Rose interrupted. The Thompsons, that name has haunted our family for too long, and now, with you carrying their grandchild. Sarah noticed her grandmother's face had gone pale. Grandma? What's wrong? The restaurant, Rose whispered. Their first restaurant, it wasn't always theirs. Before she could explain further, Rose's eyes rolled back and she collapsed. Sarah screamed for help as she caught her grandmother, lowering her gently to the floor. Within minutes, sirens wailed outside the apartment. At the hospital, Sarah paced the waiting room while James held her hand. The doctors said Rose had suffered a stroke, but they managed to stabilize her. When they finally allowed Sarah to see her, Rose was barely conscious. The box, Rose whispered. Her speech slurred. In the attic, behind the old trunk, you need to see. She drifted off to sleep before finishing. That evening, Sarah and James climbed into Rose's attic. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with memories of Sarah's childhood. Behind an old trunk, they found a battered metal box. It's locked, James said, examining it. Wait. Sarah remembered the key her grandmother always wore around her neck. They rushed back to the hospital, where a nurse helped them carefully remove Rose's necklace. Back home, Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside, she found a stack of yellowed photographs and documents. One photo made her gasp. James, look at this. She held up a faded image of a restaurant storefront. Thompson's Fine Dining, but the people standing in front, that's my great-grandparents. James leaned closer. Are you sure? Yes, and look at the date, 1931, but your mother always said her father opened their first restaurant in 1932. As they dug deeper into the box, Sarah found a newspaper clipping about the restaurant's grand opening in 1929, clearly showing her great-grandparents as the owners. Her hands froze on another document. The original deed to the restaurant. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. Your family's entire restaurant empire started with this place, but it belonged to my family first. What happened? Before James could respond, Sarah's phone rang. Rose had taken a turn for the worse. They rushed back to the hospital, the box of secrets temporarily forgotten. In the ICU, Rose briefly regained consciousness. She gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. The restaurant, they stole it. Depression, had no choice. Your great-grandfather, they blackmailed him. Thompson's father knew what he did. Grandma, save your strength, Sarah pleaded. No, Rose insisted. You need to know the truth in that box. Promise me. Make it right. Those were Rose's last clear words before slipping into unconsciousness. As Sarah watched her grandmother's breathing grow shallow, she clutched the key to the metal box. Whatever secrets it contained, she knew her life would never be the same after uncovering them. After Rose's funeral, Sarah spent days examining the contents of the metal box. Each document revealed a darker truth about the Thompson Empire's origins. James sat beside her at their kitchen table, his face growing paler with each revelation. Look at this letter, Sarah said, holding up a fragile piece of paper. It's from your grandfather to my great-grandfather, dated October 1931. James read aloud, Mr. Miller, your debt will be forgiven if you sign over the restaurant. Otherwise, the bank will know about the missing funds. Think of your children. There's more. Sarah pulled out another letter. Your grandfather didn't just take our restaurant. He did this to 5 other families during the Depression. James ran his hands through his hair. He threatened people who were already desperate, used their moments of weakness to build his empire. Sarah unfolded a newspaper article from 1931. This mentions a series of suspicious restaurant acquisitions. The reporter who wrote it disappeared a week later. She paused, feeling sick. The next article praised your grandfather as a business genius, written by a different reporter. The phone rang, making them both jump. It was Margaret. "James, darling, I'm hosting a charity gala next month. I expect you and Sarah to attend. We need to maintain appearances." James put the phone on speaker. "Mother, this isn't a good time." "Nonsense. After that Christmas scandal, you both need to show your faces. The community expects." "The community?" James interrupted. "Like the families you destroyed to build your precious empire?" Silence filled the line. When Margaret spoke again, her voice was sharp. "What are you talking about?" "We know what grandfather did, Mother. How he blackmailed struggling families during the Depression. How he stole their restaurants." "Those are lies," Margaret snapped. "Your grandfather was a business genius who threatened my great-grandfather," Sarah cut in, "who made a reporter disappear." The line went dead. James stared at the phone. "She knows. She's always known." They spent the next week uncovering more evidence. Bank records showed suspicious transfers. Letters revealed threats and blackmail. Old photographs documented the systematic destruction of families who'd spent generations building their businesses. "James," Sarah called from their home office. "I found your grandfather's diary." The small leather book contained detailed accounts of each acquisition. The writer took pride in his schemes, calling them necessary steps to build a legacy. James read passages about families begging to keep their businesses, children crying as they watched their parents sign away their lives' work. His grandfather's only response, "Weakness has no place in success." "My God," James whispered. "Everything we have, it's built on other people's suffering." Sarah touched her growing belly. "What do we do with this information?" Before James could answer, his phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "The past should stay buried. Don't destroy everything we've built." "She's threatening us," Sarah said. James nodded. "But she doesn't know we have proof. Real proof." Sarah picked up the stained apron from Christmas. "You know what we have to do." "It'll destroy her," James warned. "Like her father destroyed those families?" Sarah opened another letter. "Your grandfather ruined lives, James, and your mother kept the truth hidden while enjoying the benefits." "The charity gala," James said suddenly. "All those society people she wants to impress. All those reporters she invited." Sarah understood. The perfect time to return her Christmas gift. They spent days organizing the documents, making copies, verifying dates. Each piece of evidence told part of a story that would shatter the Thompson family's carefully constructed image. "Are you sure about this?" James asked as they finished. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Sarah placed her hand on her belly again. "Our child deserves to grow up knowing the truth, and those families deserve justice, even if it's decades late." As they prepared their plan, neither Sarah nor James noticed the car parked outside their house. Inside sat Margaret's most trusted lawyer, watching their every move. The Thompson empire hadn't survived this long by leaving things to chance. Sarah meticulously wrapped each document in tissue paper, placing them in a pristine box along with a brand new apron. Her hands trembled as she wrote the note, "To help you remember your true roots." The Thompson Foundation's annual charity gala was the social event of the season. Local news crews set up their equipment outside the main restaurant while reporters checked their invitations. "Mrs. Thompson has promised a major announcement tonight," one reporter said to her cameraman. "Something about expanding the restaurant chain nationally." Inside, Sarah and James arrived early, her small baby bump now visible in her dress. Margaret immediately approached them. "I trust you've come to your senses," she said quietly. "Family matters should stay private." "Like how you kept those families' stories private?" James replied. Margaret's smile remained fixed. "Don't test me. I've worked too hard." "You mean grandfather worked too hard?" James interrupted. "Threatening and blackmailing people. Progress requires sacrifice," Margaret hissed. "Those people were weak, we were strong. That's the natural order." Sarah felt sick, and not from the pregnancy. Those people had names, dreams, children. And now their children's children have opportunities because we created jobs, Margaret countered. "I won't let you destroy that legacy." As Margaret walked away, Sarah noticed her lawyer watching them. James squeezed her hand. "Are you ready?" Sarah nodded. The package was hidden in her car, waiting for the perfect moment. More guests arrived. City council members, business leaders, even the mayor. Margaret took the stage, all charm and sophistication. "The Thompson name has always stood for excellence," she began. "For 3 generations we've served this community." Sarah slipped out to her car. The lawyer followed but stopped to take a phone call. She retrieved the package and re-entered through the kitchen, where she'd worked part-time during college. The staff smiled at her. They remembered her kindness. Margaret continued her speech. "Today I'm proud to announce the Thompson Restaurant Group is going national. We've secured funding for 50 new locations." Sarah placed the package on the gift table near the stage. Her heart pounded. "Our success comes from hard work, determination, and strong family values." The lawyer re-entered, scanning the room. Sarah was already back at her table. "And now," Margaret lifted a glass, "I'd like to open the gifts our generous donors have brought." She started with the largest packages. Sarah felt James tense beside her as Margaret reached for the white box. "This is beautiful," Margaret said, lifting the new apron. "But what's underneath?" The color drained from her face as she read the note. Her hands shook as she lifted the first document. "Mother," James said loudly, "is something wrong?" Margaret stared at the photograph of the original restaurant, at her father's signature on the blackmail letters, at the newspaper articles about the missing reporter. "These are lies," she stammered into the microphone. "No, they're not," a voice called from the back. An elderly man stood up. "That's my father's restaurant in that picture, the one your father stole from us." Another person stood. "You have my family's business too, the one your father threatened to take if we didn't sell for pennies." More people rose. More stories emerged. The reporters' cameras rolled as Margaret's carefully constructed world crumbled. "Security," she screamed. "Remove these people. They're invited guests," James said. "Families you've been sending charity donations to for years, trying to ease your conscience." Margaret lunged for the documents, but her sudden movement knocked over a candle. The tablecloth caught fire. As security rushed to extinguish it, pages scattered across the floor. Reporters scrambled to gather the evidence. The mayor quietly left. Margaret's lawyer frantically made phone calls. "You did this," Margaret pointed at Sarah, her composure completely gone. "You ungrateful." She stopped, clutching her chest. The room spun. The last thing she saw before collapsing was Sarah rushing to help her, still showing kindness even in victory. As paramedics wheeled Margaret out, Sarah heard snippets of conversations. The Thompson empire built on blackmail. Poor families forced to sell during Depression. Decades of covered-up crimes. James held Sarah as they watched his mother being taken away. "It's over," he said. But Sarah watched Margaret's lawyer huddled with other men in suits. She saw their calculating looks. "No," she replied. "I think it's just beginning." The morning after the gala, every local news channel replayed Margaret's collapse. But that was just the beginning. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. Documents revealed at the Thompson Foundation Gala show connections between Thompson Restaurants and former state senator William Hayes, who was convicted of corruption in 1985. Sarah watched the coverage from Margaret's hospital room. Despite everything, she couldn't leave her mother-in-law alone. James had gone to meet with the restaurant group's board of directors. Margaret stirred in her bed. "Turn it off." "You need to know what's happening," Sarah said. The anchor continued. "Former Thompson employees are coming forward with allegations of tax fraud spanning decades." Margaret's heart monitor beeped faster. A nurse rushed in, glaring at Sarah. "She needs rest." "Wait," Margaret grabbed Sarah's arm. "How many others know?" "Everyone, Mrs. Thompson. The documents are public now." Margaret closed her eyes. "Get my lawyer." "He's not taking your calls," Sarah said. "None of them are." The hospital room phone rang. James's voice was tense. "The health department just suspended all our restaurant licenses. They're claiming decades of falsified inspection reports." "What?" Margaret tried to sit up. "They can't." "They can," James interrupted. "Former inspectors are talking about bribes, covered-up violations, everything." Margaret ripped off her heart monitor. Alarms blared. "I need to fix this." "Mrs. Thompson." The nurse tried to stop her. Margaret pushed past them, stumbling into the hallway. Reporters who had been camping outside immediately started filming. "Mrs. Thompson, did you know about the bribes? What about the missing health inspector from 1992? Is it true your father ordered an arson in 1933? Margaret swayed, clutching her chest. This time, her collapse was captured live on every local station. At the corporate office, James faced the board. We need to distance ourselves from... It's too late, the chairman interrupted. The FBI is investigating the tax fraud allegations. The IRS has frozen all accounts. James's phone buzzed with texts from Sarah about his mother's second collapse. As he rushed to his car, he saw employees carrying boxes out of the building. The corporate logo was already being removed from the wall. At their small church, the pastor watched the news unfold. He'd known about the Thompson family's sins for years, but had accepted their generous donations in silence. Now that silence felt like a noose around his neck. Sarah sat alone in the hospital waiting room when a detective approached her. Mrs. Collins, we need to talk about William Hayes. The corrupt senator? I don't know anything about. His body was found in 1985, Mrs. Collins, in the foundation of what became Thompson's flagship restaurant. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. That's not in any of our documents. No, the detective agreed. But his former aide started talking after seeing your evidence. Says Mr. Thompson Sr. blackmailed Hayes, then made him disappear when he threatened to confess. The walls seemed to close in. What else had they uncovered? James arrived as reporters swarmed the hospital entrance. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Employees, suppliers, banks, all cutting ties with the Thompson name. She's stabilized, Sarah told him, not mentioning the detective's visit. But the doctor says she had a minor heart attack. James slumped into a chair. Everything's gone, Sarah. The restaurants, the foundation, all of it. Some accounts are frozen, others completely empty. Mother's lawyer apparently took millions before disappearing. James, Sarah hesitated. I'm carrying twins. He looked up, tears in his eyes. What? The doctor did an ultrasound while you were gone. 2 heartbeats. Before James could respond, his phone lit up with a news alert. Thompson Restaurant Group CEO missing lawyer last seen boarding private plane. Sarah touched her belly, feeling the weight of what they'd started. They'd wanted justice, but had they unleashed something far darker? The detective's words echoed in her mind. A dead senator, a missing lawyer. How many other bodies were buried in the Thompson family's past? Outside, protesters gathered, holding signs with names of families destroyed by the Thompsons. Inside, machines beeped, keeping Margaret alive. And somewhere, men in suits were uncovering decades of secrets that would destroy far more than just a restaurant empire. Margaret sat alone in her mansion, staring at the TV she couldn't turn off. Every channel told the story of her family's downfall. Empty rooms echoed with memories as staff quietly packed their belongings and left. Thompson Empire CEO indicted on 47 counts of tax fraud, the news ticker scrolled. FBI expands investigation into decades of financial crimes. She picked up a framed photo of her father. Behind his proud smile, she now saw the truth she'd spent decades denying. You taught me that power was everything, she whispered to the image. That people were weak or strong, nothing in between. A memory surfaced. She was 12, watching her father negotiate with a restaurant owner. The man was crying, begging. Her father's voice was cold. Weakness deserves no mercy. The doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find 2 FBI agents. Mrs. Thompson, we have more questions about Senator Hayes. She let them in, her mask of dignity cracking. As they questioned her about the night the senator disappeared, more memories flooded back. She'd overheard her father on the phone that night. Hayes is becoming a problem. Yes, the new restaurant's foundation gets poured tomorrow. No witnesses. Mrs. Thompson? The agent's voice pulled her back. You were 19 when Hayes disappeared, working at the restaurant. Did you notice anything unusual? Margaret's hands shook. I was taught not to question my father. After they left, she found herself in her father's old study. The leather ledgers still lined the shelves. Records of every acquisition, every threat, every ruined family. Her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Thompson? I'm calling about your father's debt to my family. She recognized the voice. Daughter of another restaurant owner from the 30s. Whatever he took, I can pay. Money? The woman laughed bitterly. My father killed himself after your father took everything. My mother died in poverty. You can't pay for that. Margaret reached for her checkbook anyway. The woman hung up. More calls followed. More stories, more lives destroyed by her father's ruthlessness and her own willing blindness. She tried calling her lawyer again. Still no answer. The news said he'd been spotted in Mexico. Desperate, she drove to Sarah and James's house. Through the window, she saw them talking with the families from the gala, sharing photos, comparing documents, building a case that would bury the Thompson name forever. She knocked. Sarah answered. "I'll pay," Margaret blurted out. "Whatever it takes. Name your price." Sarah's hand rested on her growing belly. "Some things can't be bought, Mrs. Thompson." "Please," Margaret's voice cracked. "This is my life's work." "No," Sarah replied. "This is your father's life's work, built on stolen dreams and buried bodies." The word bodies hit Margaret like a physical blow. She saw herself at 19 watching concrete pour into the restaurant foundation, hearing muffled sounds that she convinced herself were machinery. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't want to know." "That's the problem," Sarah said. "You chose not to see the truth, just like you chose not to see me as a person." Margaret stumbled back to her car. As she drove home, memories kept surfacing. Her father teaching her to despise common people. Her mother's silent tears at night. The missing reporter's wife begging at their door. At home, she found more FBI agents waiting. More questions about Hayes. About the reporter. About other disappearances. She ran inside, locking the door. The mansion felt like a tomb. Photos of 3 generations of Thompsons stared down at her. Proud, powerful, predatory. Margaret collapsed in her father's study. In a hidden drawer, she found one last ledger, the oldest one. Her father's first acquisitions. The final entry was about the Miller's restaurant. Sarah's family. Threatened to expose bank fraud. Leverage during depression. Acquisition complete. Miller broken. No further threat. Margaret saw herself giving Sarah that stained apron. She'd become everything her father had been. Outside, more reporters gathered, more agents waited, more victims prepared to testify. The price of pride was finally being collected, and Margaret Thompson was bankrupt in every way that mattered. Sarah spent her evenings at the community center, secretly helping families affected by the Thompson scandal. Many former restaurant employees had lost their jobs when the locations closed. While the media focused on the scandal, these families struggled to pay bills. "We've set up a food bank," Sarah told a former waitress. "And there's a job fair next week. Several restaurants are hiring." "Why are you helping us?" the woman asked. "After what the Thompsons did to your family?" Sarah thought about her grandmother Rose, because breaking a cycle of hurt starts with kindness. Unknown to Sarah, Margaret had followed her to the center. She watched from her car as Sarah organized food donations, made calls for job placements, and offered comfort to people whose lives her family had destroyed. Margaret's phone buzzed with news alerts. Thompson restaurants, health code violations date back to 1950s. Former employee reveals systematic wage theft. FBI expands investigation. More bodies suspected. She turned off her phone, but couldn't turn off her conscience. Inside the center, she saw Sarah doing what the Thompson Foundation had claimed to do for years, actually helping people. The next morning, Margaret attended church for the first time in months. She sat in the back, but people still moved away from her. Pastor Roberts approached the pulpit. "Today's sermon is about redemption." Margaret felt all eyes turn to her. "We've seen hard truths come to light," the pastor continued. "Truth that many of us ignored because it was convenient. Because the donations were generous. I stand here ashamed of my own silence." Margaret stood to leave, but his next words stopped her. "But God's grace isn't just for the perfect. It's for the broken, for those who've lost their way." She sank back into the pew, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she truly felt the weight of her sins. After the service, she tried to approach Sarah, who was also there. But before she could reach her, Sarah collapsed. "Call an ambulance," James shouted. "She's bleeding." At the hospital, doctors rushed Sarah into emergency care. "Complications with the twins," a nurse explained. Margaret paced the waiting room. Other church members arrived to support James, but kept their distance from her. Hours passed. James finally emerged from Sarah's room, his face pale. "The twins are at risk," he said. "She needs complete bed rest. But we can't afford. The accounts are still frozen." "I'll pay," Margaret said immediately. "Your money's gone, Mother. The lawyers took everything." Margaret removed her wedding ring, the last valuable thing she owned. This should cover it. James stared at the ring. Why? Because Sarah showed me what real charity looks like, Margaret whispered. While I was writing tax-deductible checks, she was actually helping people without cameras, without praise. Mrs. Thompson? A nurse interrupted. Sarah's asking for you. In the hospital room, Sarah lay pale but conscious. I saw you at the community center. Margaret nodded. I saw you too, helping people I hurt. They're not just names in ledgers, Sarah said. They're people, with dreams, with children. I know that now, Margaret's voice broke. I know it too late. Sarah reached for her hand. It's never too late to change. Before Margaret could respond, Pastor Roberts entered the room. Margaret, the FBI is here. They have more questions about Senator Hayes. Margaret looked at Sarah, then at James. I need to tell the truth. All of it. Mother, they'll arrest you, James warned. Maybe that's what redemption looks like, Margaret said. Not hiding anymore. Not pretending. She walked out to meet the FBI agents, passing other church members in the hallway. Their faces showed not contempt now, but something closer to pity. In Sarah's room, James watched his mother leave. Do you think she's really changed? Sarah touched her belly, feeling the twins move. Change isn't a moment. It's a journey. She's finally taken the first step. Outside, reporters filmed as Margaret was led to an FBI car. But for the first time since the scandal broke, she walked with her head high, not in pride, but in acceptance of the truth. The headline shocked the community. Margaret Thompson attempts suicide in detention center. She had been found unconscious in her cell by Maria Ramirez, a janitor she'd fired 5 years ago for reporting health violations. I couldn't let her die, Maria told reporters, no matter what she did. Sarah watched the news from her hospital bed, where she remained under observation for pregnancy complications. We have to help her, James. After everything she's done, she's still your mother, and she's finally facing the truth. In the psychiatric ward, Margaret stared at the ceiling. Memories flooded back, not of her crimes, but of her own childhood. Her father forcing her to watch as he threatened families. This is how you build power, he'd said. The psychiatrist visited daily. Why now, Mrs. Thompson? Why try to end it? I saw my reflection, Margaret whispered, in every person I'd hurt, in every life I'd destroyed, just like my father destroyed me. While Margaret underwent treatment, Sarah's condition worsened. The twins were in distress. We need specialized care, the doctor explained. The nearest facility is in Boston. The cost was astronomical. James sold their car, then their house. It wasn't enough. Then Margaret made a decision. From her hospital bed, she signed over her mansion to cover Sarah's medical bills. Your father's house, her lawyer objected. The Thompson legacy. A house built on suffering, Margaret replied. Let it finally do some good. The revelation about Senator Hayes' murder brought more charges. Margaret's former business partner threatened to expose more secrets unless she paid him off. No more hiding, Margaret told him. No more bribes. He released the videos, decades of backroom deals, threats, and payoffs. The investigation expanded. The stress sent Sarah into early labor. As she fought for the twins' lives, Margaret confessed everything to the FBI. I knew about Hayes, she admitted, about the others too. I chose not to see to protect our name, our pride. The judge offered a deal, house arrest instead of prison, if she helped prosecute other corrupt business leaders. Many families in this town built fortunes the same way, the prosecutor explained. You can help us end it. Margaret chose the harder path. No deals. I'll help you, but I'll face the full consequences. She testified about everything. Her father's crimes, her own complicity, the whole corrupt network. Other prominent families faced charges. The pastor publicly confessed his silence. The town's entire power structure began to crumble. James visited his mother in custody. Sarah's in critical condition, the twins. Margaret clutched his hand. Take everything I have left. Save them. There's nothing left to take, Mother. The next day, Margaret appeared in court for sentencing. The judge asked if she had any last words. I apologize to every family we destroyed, she said. Money and power became our gods. We sacrificed our souls for success. The judge ordered a 15-year sentence. As guards led her away, she saw Sarah's grandmother's photo in the evidence files. Wait, she called to James. The original restaurant deed. Give it back to Sarah's family. Let something good come from all this. That night, Sarah had an emergency C-section. The twins' lives hung by a thread. In her cell, Margaret prayed for the first time in decades. Not for herself, but for Sarah and the babies. The news reached her the next morning. Both twins had survived. A boy and a girl. They're naming the girl Rose, the guard told her, after Sarah's grandmother. Margaret touched the cold wall of her cell. Outside, reporters still camped at the prison gates. More prominent families faced arrests each day. The old power structure was dying. But in a hospital room across town, new life fought to survive. And in a prison cell, an old woman finally faced the truth about herself. Not with pride or defiance, but with the humble recognition that redemption begins with accepting justice. The church was packed for Margaret's public confession. Under guard supervision, she stood before the congregation, her prison uniform replacing her usual designer clothes. "My family built an empire on stolen dreams," she began. "I'm here to confess not just to crimes, but to the sin of pride that blinded me for decades." Pastor Roberts stood beside her. Margaret has asked to make this confession before seeking forgiveness from each family individually. In the front row, Sarah sat in a wheelchair, still recovering from the C-section. The twins, Rose and Thomas, were in the hospital's NICU fighting for their lives. "Each night in my cell," Margaret continued, "I read the letters from families we destroyed. I finally see the true cost of our success, not in dollars, but in broken lives." She detailed every crime, every threat, every act of corruption. People wept as she named their grandparents, their parents, the restaurants, and dreams her family had stolen. "I can't undo the past," she said, "but I can tell the truth, the whole truth." After church, FBI agents drove Margaret to the hospital. They waited outside while she visited the NICU for the first time. Through the glass, she watched her grandchildren fight for survival. Each tiny breath a battle, each heartbeat a miracle. "They're getting stronger," Sarah said from her wheelchair. "Just like their grandmother is getting stronger by facing the truth." Margaret pressed her hand against the glass. "I don't deserve to be called their grandmother." "Redemption isn't about deserving," Sarah replied. "It's about changing." That week, more prominent families followed Margaret's lead. The mayor resigned. Business leaders confessed to decades of corruption. The old power structure crumbled as truth after truth emerged. James met with the restaurant employees who'd lost their jobs. "We're transforming the remaining properties into a cooperative. Every worker will be part owner." The idea came from Sarah, who remembered her grandmother's stories about the original restaurant, how it had been a community gathering place, not just a business. Margaret worked from prison, signing over properties, providing evidence, testifying against other corrupt leaders. Each revelation brought more pain, more shame, but also steps toward redemption. Then Rose, the smaller twin, had a setback. Her heart was failing. "She needs surgery," the doctor explained. "Experimental. Insurance won't cover it." The same day, Margaret's former business partner offered a deal. He'd pay for the surgery if she'd stop testifying. Margaret didn't hesitate. No more deals. No more secrets. Instead, she went public with her story. A journalist interviewed her in prison, broadcasting her full confession nationwide. Other wealthy families across the country faced similar accusations. Margaret's testimony sparked investigations in multiple states. The community rallied around the twins. The same people who'd lost jobs and businesses to the Thompsons now donated what they could for Rose's surgery. "Why?" James asked one former employee who donated his severance pay. "Because your mother finally told the truth," the man replied. "And your wife showed us what real compassion looks like." Pastor Roberts organized a prayer vigil during Rose's surgery. The church filled with former employees, affected families, and even some who'd participated in the corruption, all praying together. Margaret watched the surgery's progress through calls from her cell. Each hour brought new anxiety, new prayers from a woman who'd never truly prayed before. Finally, James called with news. "Rose made it. She's going to live." Margaret sank to her knees in her cell. Outside, she could hear other inmates watching her story on TV, learning how the mighty had fallen, not in disgrace, but in truth. That night, Sarah brought photos of the twins to the prison. "Rose opened her eyes today," she said. "They're blue, like yours." Margaret touched the photo through the glass partition. "When she's older, tell her my story. The full story, Let her learn from my sins. We'll tell her about your redemption too, Sarah said. How her grandmother finally chose truth over pride. As Sarah left, Margaret watched through the prison window as news crews interviewed more families coming forward with their own stories of corruption and redemption. The truth was spreading, painfully but purposefully, like healing after surgery. 6 months passed. The twins grew stronger each day, defying early medical predictions. Sarah watched them sleep in their nursery, remembering the long journey from that Christmas dinner to this moment. The news played quietly on her phone. Thompson restaurant properties transform into worker-owned cooperatives. James entered with more paperwork. The first training program starts next week. Former employees teaching new ones. Even some of the families we hurt are joining as instructors. Sarah picked up Rose, who had her grandmother's blue eyes. Have you told your mother? I'm visiting her today. The FBI is considering reducing her sentence for continued cooperation. At the prison, Margaret looked different. The designer clothes and perfect hair were gone, but so was the hardness in her face. She stared at the latest photos of the twins. Rose looks like you, Sarah said during visiting hours. She looks innocent, Margaret replied. Let's pray she stays that way. The guard brought papers for Margaret to sign, transferring the last Thompson properties into the cooperative trust. The first class has 20 students, James explained. People who lost everything in the recession. Single parents, immigrants. Like Sarah's grandparents were, Margaret said softly, before we destroyed their dream. Outside the prison, the former Thompson flagship restaurant reopened. The new sign read, Community Kitchen, where every dream gets a second chance. Former employees trained new staff in cooking, management, and business ethics. Each trainee would become part owner after graduation. This is what the American dream should be, Sarah told reporters. Not building empires by destroying others, but growing together as a community. The story caught national attention. Other cities contacted them about replicating the model. James traveled to speak about business ethics and redemption. Margaret watched it all from prison, continuing to provide evidence about corruption in other corporations. Her testimony launched investigations across the country. Why do you keep confessing? Her lawyer asked. You could have made deals, kept some assets. Because every secret exposed helps another family heal, she replied. Every truth told frees someone else to tell theirs. The twins turned 6 months old on the day the first class graduated from the community kitchen program. 20 new worker owners received their certificates. Sarah brought the ceremony video to Margaret. Watch this. On the screen, a young woman spoke. My grandmother's restaurant was taken by the Thompsons in 1935. Today, I'm reclaiming that dream, not in anger, but in hope. Margaret wiped tears as she watched more graduates speak. Children and grandchildren of families her father had destroyed, now building new futures. Then came a surprise. The graduates had recorded a message for her. Mrs. Thompson, their spokesperson said, your confession gave us back our history. Your transformation showed us that change is possible. Thank you for choosing truth over pride. That night, national news covered the graduation. A model of redemption and community renewal, they called it. Other wealthy families facing corruption charges began contacting James about following their example. The next morning, Sarah brought the twins to the prison again. This time she had news. The FBI says you'll be allowed to attend the next graduation. Under guard, but still. Margaret touched the glass separating her from her grandchildren. I don't deserve it. This isn't about deserving, Sarah reminded her. It's about healing. The community needs to see that redemption is real. As she held Rose, Sarah noticed the baby reaching toward her grandmother through the glass. Margaret pressed her hand against the barrier, matching her granddaughter's tiny fingers. The next class has 40 students, James said, including 3 families we hurt in the past. They're all working together, learning together. Margaret nodded, still watching Rose. Maybe that's the real legacy I should have built. Not an empire of fear, but a community of hope. Outside the prison, more news crews arrived to cover the growing story of transformation. The community kitchen model was spreading, changing how people thought about business and success. The American dream was being redefined, not as a climb to the top over others, but as a journey upward together. The former Thompson mansion stood transformed. Where pride and power once ruled, hope now lived. The sprawling estate had become the community support center, its gates open to all who needed help. On dedication day, 5 years after that fateful Christmas, hundreds gathered on the mansion's grounds. Margaret, recently released from prison, stood quietly at the back of the crowd. Her designer clothes replaced by simple attire, her bearing humble rather than proud. Sarah approached the podium, now visibly pregnant with her third child. The twins, Rose and Thomas, now 5 years old, sat in the front row with James. 5 years ago, a stained apron sparked a revolution, Sarah began. Not a violent one, but a revolution of truth and transformation. Today, we're not just opening a community center, we're celebrating a new way of building success together. The crowd included faces from every chapter of their story. Former restaurant employees who'd become business owners, families who'd lost everything to the Thompsons, now leading training programs, even some of Margaret's former society friends who'd followed her path to redemption. The community kitchen program has graduated over 1,000 people, Sarah continued. Our model has spread to 30 cities. But numbers don't tell the real story. Lives tell it. Dreams rebuilt tell it. Hope restored tells it. She gestured to the building behind her. This mansion was built on broken dreams. Now it will rebuild them. The ballroom is now a job training center. The formal gardens are teaching plots for urban farming. Every room that once showcased wealth will now create it. Not for the few, but for many. The twins ran to Margaret, hugging her legs. She'd missed most of their early years in prison, but they'd visited every week, building a bond that transcended bars and guilt. Look what we made, Grandma. Rose held up a small apron, decorated with childish drawings. For the ceremony, Margaret took it with trembling hands. The simple gift meant more than all the designer clothes she'd once owned. James stepped up to the podium. Today, we're also announcing the Thompson Restoration Fund. Using recovered assets from corrupt businesses nationwide, we'll help more communities transform greed into growth, pride into purpose. The initiative had already raised millions. Other wealthy families, following Margaret's example, had confessed to past crimes and donated their ill-gotten gains to the fund. My mother taught me that the American dream meant climbing to the top, James said. Today, she's teaching us all that true success means lifting others as we rise. Margaret didn't expect to be called forward, but Sarah gestured for her to join them. The crowd's reaction surprised her. Not scorn or reluctant acceptance, but genuine respect. They'd watched her transform from a proud socialite to a humble truth-teller, from a destroyer of dreams to a supporter of them. The stained apron that started this journey is now in a display case inside, Sarah announced. Next to it is a new one, clean, unsigned, ready for the next chapter. Margaret finally spoke, her voice carrying years of hard-earned wisdom. Pride built these walls, truth broke them down, but love is rebuilding something far more beautiful. The ceremony continued with testimonials from program graduates. A former dishwasher now owned his own cafe. An immigrant woman had opened a catering business. The grandson of a ruined restaurant owner now taught business ethics. Inside the mansion, the transformation was complete. The grand staircase now displayed photos of program graduates. The crystal chandeliers illuminated classrooms. The wine cellar had become a food bank. The twins led tours, proud of their role in the new legacy. This is where we teach cooking, Rose explained to visitors. And this is where Mommy helps people start businesses. Thomas added, and this is where Grandma tells her story, so people learn about telling the truth. In the main hall, the two aprons hung side by side, the stained one that sparked the revolution, the clean one representing its future. A reporter asked Margaret about her feelings. Do you regret that Christmas dinner? The apron that exposed everything? Margaret watched Sarah helping a young mother fill out business loan papers, saw James mentoring a group of aspiring entrepreneurs, noticed her grandchildren proudly wearing their own small aprons as they helped serve refreshments. Regret the loss of pride and power? Margaret shook her head. No, that apron didn't expose us. It unveiled us, showed us who we could become. The day ended with a community dinner in the former ballroom. People from all walks of life shared food, dreams, and hope. The rigid social barriers that once defined the town had dissolved. Margaret sat between her grandchildren, helping them with their plates. She remembered another dinner, 5 years ago, when she tried to put Sarah in her place with a stained apron. "You know," she told the twins, "sometimes the greatest gifts don't look like gifts at all. Sometimes they look like stains, like mistakes, like problems. But if we face them with truth, they become something better." Rose finished, wise beyond her years. The sun set on the community support center. Inside, people continued to talk, plan, and dream. The mansion that once represented the power of one family now embodied the strength of an entire community. Sarah found Margaret alone later, looking at the 2 aprons. "The stained one reminds us where we started," Sarah said. "The clean one shows where we're going." Margaret touched the clean apron gently. "Not just where we're going, where everyone can go when we choose truth over pride, community over power." Outside, the mansion's lights glowed warmly, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. Inside, dreams were being rebuilt. One truth, one lesson, one person at a time. The American dream hadn't died, it had transformed, like Margaret, like the mansion, like the community itself, from a solitary climb to a shared journey, from building empires to building hope. And it all started with a stained apron on Christmas Day. As the dedication ceremony wound down, a surprise visitor arrived. Maria Ramirez, the janitor who had saved Margaret's life in prison, stepped forward with her family. "I have something to show you," she said, leading Margaret to a small table in the corner of the transformed ballroom. There, spread out before them, were newspaper clippings from 30 years ago. They showed Maria's father standing proud in front of his small bakery, one of the businesses the Thompsons had destroyed. "For years, I hated you," Maria said quietly. "But when I saw you in that cell, ready to end everything, I realized hate only continues the cycle." Margaret touched the yellowed papers gently. "Your father's bakery. I remember the day we took it. Today, my son graduates from the community kitchen program." Maria smiled. "He's opening a bakery in the same neighborhood, not with bitterness, but with hope." The story spread through the room, touching everyone present. Here was the transformation they'd all been part of, coming full circle. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Sarah found an old business ledger in the mansion's study. But unlike the ones filled with records of threats and takeovers, this one was new. Its pages contained the stories of every graduate, every rebuilt dream, every transformed life. "We should add Maria's son's story," James suggested, taking the ledger. "A new kind of Thompson record-keeping." The twins had fallen asleep on a couch, their small aprons still tied around their waists. Rose clutched a photo of her great-grandmother, Sarah's grandmother, who had started this journey of truth with her hidden box of evidence. Margaret sat beside them, gently stroking Rose's hair. "You know what I learned in prison?" she said to Sarah. "Success isn't what we build, it's what we build others up to achieve." The next morning, as the sun rose over the community support center, people were already gathering. A young woman waited by the gates with her children, hoping to enroll in the next training program. A former executive arrived to volunteer as a mentor, his own journey of transformation inspired by Margaret's story. The local newspaper's headline read, "Thompson Legacy Reborn, From Power to Empowerment." Below was a photo of 3 generations, Margaret, Sarah, and the twins, all wearing simple aprons as they served others. Inside the center, the day began with orientation for new participants. Margaret, no longer the proud socialite, shared her story with each group. Not to wallow in guilt, but to show that change was possible, that truth could heal even the deepest wounds. "When I gave Sarah that stained apron," she told them, "I thought I was putting her in her place. Instead, it put me in mine and showed me a better way to live." The twins started a small tradition of their own, greeting each new person with a handmade paper apron name tag. Because aprons mean new beginnings, Rose would explain with the simple wisdom of a child. As the center thrived, it became a model for similar transformations across the country. Other wealthy families, faced with their own histories of corruption and pride, looked to the Thompson story not with judgment, but with hope for their own redemption. Sarah's 3rd child, a girl, was born in the spring. They named her Maria, after the woman whose compassion had saved her grandmother's life. Another thread in the tapestry of healing they were weaving together. The stained apron that had started it all became more than just a display piece. It became a symbol of the power of truth to transform lives, of the possibility of redemption, and of the strength found in community. And in the quiet moments, when the center was empty and the day's work was done, Margaret would often stand between the two displayed aprons, the stained one that marked her fall, and the clean one that represented hope. In their contrast, she saw the story of America itself, not just the dream of success, but the deeper dream of becoming better together. The Thompson name, once synonymous with power and pride, now stood for something greater. Not an empire built on broken dreams, but a community built on shared hopes. Not a legacy of fear, but a future of possibility. And it all began with a moment of cruelty that became a catalyst for kindness, a stain that became a symbol of cleansing, an ending that became a beginning. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs hope today. What would you have done in Sarah's place? Let us know in the comments below. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss our next touching story. And always remember, true success isn't measured by what we own, but by the lives we touch and the hearts we transform.